Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're diving into a pretty complex topic. It's a fascinating puzzle, really, connecting brain health and autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah, definitely complex, but really interesting.
You shared some interesting scientific research with us.
I did.
And our mission today is to try and unpack this potential link between the brain and difficulties it has in getting this crucial nutrient, folate,
Yep.
and ASD, and we're also going to explore a possible way to address this. So this is a big one.
It is.
So first, can you remind everyone the title of this research we're going to be looking at today?
Sure. The research that we're taking a deep dive into today is a comprehensive review and meta-analysis titled Cerebral Folate Deficiency, Folate Receptor Alpha Autoantibodies, and Leucovorin, Folinic Acid, Treatment in Autism Spectrum Disorders.
Okay, wow, that's a mouthful.
It is.
So before we get too far, let's talk about why this deep dive into folate and brain health even matters.
Okay.
Why should our listeners care about this?
Well, the research suggests that for some individuals with ASD, there might be a really fundamental challenge in getting enough folate into the brain.
Right.
And as you said, this is a nutrient that is absolutely vital for brain function. What makes this so interesting is there's an existing treatment, leucovorin, also known as folinic acid,
Okay.
that's being investigated to help with this. So this could lead to some really new ways of thinking about and supporting some people with autism.
Yeah, this is really cutting edge stuff that I think a lot of people in the ASD community are going to want to know about.
I think so too.
So we're exploring whether this specific biological factor, the availability of folate in the brain, could be a significant piece of the ASD puzzle.
Yeah,
And whether a targeted treatment could help address it.
exactly.
So before we go any further, let's just make sure we're all speaking the same language. First, what exactly is folate? Why is it so essential, especially for the brain?
Okay, so folate is a B vitamin. It's an essential nutrient, meaning our bodies can't make it, so we have to get it from our diet.
Stop it.
And it plays a critical role in many bodily processes. We're talking about things like cell growth and division DNA synthesis. And for the brain, it's absolutely crucial for healthy development and ongoing function. Think of it as a fundamental building block and a key ingredient for the brain to operate properly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we hear about something called cerebral folate deficiency, or CFD.
Right.
That sounds like it's more than just not getting enough folate in your diet overall.
Yes, exactly. Cerebral folate deficiency specifically refers to a state where the levels of folate are low within the brain itself, and this can happen even if someone has normal levels of folate in their bloodstream. When the brain doesn't have enough folate, it can lead to a variety of neurological issues.
Okay, so how does folate actually get from our blood into the brain? That's where this folate receptor alpha, or GRIA, comes into play, right? Sounds like a gatekeeper.
It is. That's a perfect analogy. So the folate receptor alpha is a protein that sits on the cells of the blood-brain barrier, that protective layer surrounding the brain. And its job is to grab a specific active form of folate called 5-MTHF and transport it across this barrier into the brain. So think of it as a special doorway with a very specific key for folate to enter.
Okay, and unfortunately, sometimes things can go wrong with these gatekeepers,
Right.
leading to the production of what are called folate receptor alpha autoantibodies, or FRAAs.
Yes,
That's quite a mouthful.
it is.
What are they doing?
So these autoantibodies are actually produced by the body's own immune system. In this case, the immune system mistakenly identifies the FRAA protein as something foreign and creates antibodies that target it. These antibodies can then interfere with FRAA's ability to do its job of transporting folate. So the review highlights two main types of FRAs. We have blocking autoantibodies, which directly prevent the folate from binding to the receptor. Think about it as like putting a lock on that doorway we talked about. And then we have binding autoantibodies, which attach to the receptor but might not directly block the folate. However, these binding antibodies might still cause problems, for example, by changing the receptor's shape or signaling it to be removed or destroyed.
So these FRAAs were essentially gumming up the works of this vital folate transport system.
Exactly.
And the treatment being investigated is leucovorin,
Yes.
or folinic acid. How does that help?
So leucovorin is another active form of folate, but the really important thing about it is that it can be transported into the brain through a different pathway, potentially bypassing some of the issues caused by a malfunctioning FRAA or the presence of those autoantibodies. So it's like having a different route to get the needed folate into the brain when the usual doorway is blocked.
So that's really interesting. So the central calling we're really trying to answer in this deep dive is this. Does this whole picture, cerebral folate deficiency, potentially triggered by these FRAAs, play a significant role in autism spectrum disorder?
Right.
And if it does, can treatment with leucovorin make a positive difference?
A big question.
Big question. So let's dive into what the research reveals.
Let's do it.
What does it say?
So the review first looked at the reported links between CFD and ASD.
Okay.
And several studies have found evidence of CFD in individuals with an ASD diagnosis. They even highlighted a study from 2002 that described a unique situation where children had very low folate levels, specifically in their cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid surrounding the brain and spinal cord.
Okay.
Even though their overall folate levels in the body were normal,
Huh.
interestingly, these children showed improvement when treated with folinic acid.
Wow. So that's an early finding, but it sounds really important.
It is.
So if the folate isn't getting into the brain properly in some individuals with ASD, what seems to be causing that transport issue?
Well, as we discussed, the primary suspect is the impaired transport of folates across the blood-brain barrier.
Right.
And this is often linked to problems with the folate receptor alpha. Now, the meta-analysis in this review actually looked at how often CFD and ASD occur together. They found that in cases where CFD was diagnosed, a notable 44% of those individuals also had ASD. Conversely, in individuals with ASD, the pooled prevalence of CFD was 38%. So a significant takeaway here for you is that a substantial portion of individuals with ASD may experience difficulties with folate reaching their brain.
Wow. Those are pretty striking numbers.
They are.
Really suggests a real overlap.
Yeah.
But the review also pointed out that there is quite a bit of variation in these numbers across different studies. Why might that be?
That's a crucial observation, and it likely means that CFD isn't a universal characteristic of all individuals with ASD.
Right.
The reasons for this variability could include differences in how CFD was defined and measured in each study, the specific characteristics of the groups of people with ASD being studied, and the possibility that other factors might be contributing in different individuals.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of other factors, the review also investigated the underlying causes of CFD in ASD.
Yes.
In the cases where they could identify a cause, what did they discover?
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
They found that in a remarkable 83% of the ASD cases where the reason for CFD could be determined, folate receptor alpha autoantibodies were implicated.
Wow, that's a big percentage.
It is. Beyond the folate pathway, the review also pointed to mitochondrial dysfunction as another potential contributor to CFD in some ASD cases, accounting for 43% of those where a cause was found.
Okay.
Mitochondria are like the powerhouses of our cells, and their proper function is crucial for brain energy and overall health. Issues with mitochondria could therefore also impact how the brain utilizes nutrients like folate. Genetic abnormalities in the gene that codes for FRAA were found to be a much less common cause, around 14%.
So it really seems like these FRAAs are a major piece of the puzzle
They seem to be.
when it comes to potentially causing CFD in a significant number of individuals with ASD who have this folate deficiency.
Right.
So that naturally leads us to the next big question.
Okay.
What role do these FRAAs play in ASD more broadly, even in those who haven't been diagnosed with CFD?
Well, the review indicates that FRAAs have been found quite frequently in individuals with ASD, regardless of whether they have confirmed CFD.
Okay.
The overall prevalence of FRAAs, looking at both the blocking and binding types in individuals with ASD, was found to be a substantial 71%. And the review highlighted that this number was actually quite consistent across the various studies they analyzed.
Wow, 71% is a really high number. That strongly suggests that these autoantibodies are not just a coincidental finding,
Right.
but could play a critical role in the development or manifestation of ASD for many individuals. Did the researchers compare these numbers to other groups?
They did, and the difference was quite striking. The meta-analysis found that children with ASD were a staggering 19 times more likely to have FRAAs compared to typically developing children who didn't have a sibling with ASD. That's a really significant difference that underscores the potential importance of these autoantibodies.
Yeah, 19 times. It's huge. That really emphasizes the potential significance of these autoantibodies in ASD. We talked earlier about blocking and binding types of FRAAs. Do they seem to have different effects?
The research suggests they might. 2 studies found a significant inverse relationship. Higher levels of FRAAs in the bloodstream were associated with lower levels of that crucial 5-MTHF folate form in the cerebrospinal fluid. This strongly indicates that these antibodies are indeed interfering with the transport of folate into the brain. One study even suggested that the levels of blocking FRAs might decrease as children get older, while another found that continued consumption of cow's milk could potentially lead to an increase in blocking FRAs over time, hinting at a possible environmental influence.
Wow, that's fascinating. So could something as common as diet potentially be influencing these autoantibody levels and even treatment outcomes?
It certainly raises that question, and the research goes even further into the types of FRAs. One study proposed that the specific type of FRAA a child with ASD has, whether it's primarily blocking or binding, might be connected to different physiological and developmental characteristics. For example, in one study, bounding FRAs were associated with higher levels of vitamin B12, while blocking FRAs were linked to better redox metabolism and communication skills in another. So it's not just about the presence or absence of these antibodies, but potentially the specific type that matters.
I feel like we're peeling back layers of complexity here.
We are.
What about family connections? Since ASD has a genetic component, were FRAAs also found in family members of children with ASD?
Yes, they were. FRAs were also detected in parents with a pooled prevalence of 45% and in typically developing siblings with a prevalence of 61% of children with ASD. However, the likelihood of having FRAs was lower in these family members compared to the children with ASD themselves when compared to unrelated control groups. This raises some intriguing questions about familial factors and whether the presence of FRAs alone is enough to lead to ASD or if other factors need to be involved. Considering how common these autoantibodies appear to be in ASD, you might be wondering if this could be a factor that healthcare professionals should be looking into more routinely.
It sounds like there might be a familial predisposition, but it's not a guarantee of developing ASD. This is complex stuff indeed.
It is.
All right, let's shift our focus now to the potential treatment Leucovorin.
Okay.
The review looked at several studies that investigated its use in individuals with ASD. What did they find?
Given this intriguing connection between folate issues and ASD, the next logical step in our deep dive is to explore the potential of Leucovorin as a treatment.
Okay.
The review examined studies that use Leucovorin to treat individuals with ASD, including both those who had been diagnosed with CFD and those who hadn't. Let's start by looking at the outcomes for the group that had both ASD and confirmed CFD.
Okay, what did the research show for that group?
The meta-analysis showed some really encouraging results. In children with both ASD and CFD who were treated with Leucovorin, significant improvements were seen across a range of challenging symptoms. Overall, ASD symptoms improved in 67% of cases, irritability in 58%, ataxia, which is a lack of muscle coordination, in a remarkable 88%. Pyramidal signs, indicating issues with motor pathways in the brain, in 76%, movement disorders in 47%, and even epilepsy in 75%.
Wow, those are some really high percentages of improvement across a variety of significant challenges.
It is.
Did Leucovorin have any impact on the folate levels in the brain itself?
Yes, several studies reported that Leucovorin treatment helped to normalize the levels of 5-MTHF in the cerebrospinal fluid in these children with CFD.
Okay.
One study also noted a trend suggesting that younger children with CFD might experience more significant improvements when treated with Leucovorin.
And we touched on the potential link with cow's milk earlier.
Yes.
Did that play a role in how well treatment worked?
Interestingly, one study reported that when cow's milk was removed from the diet along with Leucovorin treatment, it also led to improvements. The researchers hypothesized that this might be because removing cow's milk could help to reduce the levels of those FRAA autoantibodies.
Huh. That really reinforces the potential connection between diet autoantibodies and how effective treatment might be. Now, what about using Leucovorin to treat general ASD in children who didn't necessarily have a confirmed diagnosis of CFD?
Right.
This could potentially impact a much larger group of people.
Absolutely. The review looked at several controlled studies that investigated Leucovorin on its own in this population. One study, which used a wait list as a control group, found significant improvements in verbal communication, both expressive and receptive language, attention, and repetitive behaviors in children who tested positive for FRAAs and were treated with Leucovorin.
That's particularly interesting that the improvements seemed more noticeable in the children who had these autoantibodies.
Yeah.
What about studies that used a placebo as a comparison?
There were a couple of key placebo-controlled studies. One double-blind study reported significant improvements in verbal communication in the group receiving Leucovorin compared to the placebo group. They even calculated a number needed to treat, which was quite low, suggesting that relatively few children needed to be treated to see an improvement in verbal communication. This effect was even stronger in the subgroup of children who were positive for FRAAs. This study also noted improvements in social withdrawal and repetitive behaviors.
Okay, that's compelling evidence coming from a rigorous placebo-controlled trial. Was there another one?
Yes. A smaller, single-blind, placebo-controlled study also found significant improvements in overall autism severity and social interaction in the children who received Leucovorin. Additionally, a retrospective survey of parents reported improvements in cognition, attention, and communication with higher doses of oral folinic acid.
Wow. So going back to why this research matters, these findings suggest that for some individuals struggling with communication or other aspects of ASD, a readily available intervention targeting folate transport could potentially make a real difference.
Exactly.
So even in children with general ASD, not just those with confirmed CFD,
Right.
Leucovorin seems to show some positive effects, particularly in areas like communication.
Uh-huh.
What about when Leucovorin was used in combination with other supplements or medications?
Several studies explored this approach, combining leucovorins with multivitamins or other nutritional supports. These studies also generally showed positive effects on various ASD symptoms. However, as you can imagine, it's more challenging in these cases to pinpoint the specific contribution of leucovorin, since the improvements could be due to the combination of treatments. One study did find that adding leucovorin to risperidone treatment led to greater improvement in certain behavioral measures compared to using risperidone with a placebo. In a prospective study comparing treated, including leucovorin for FRAA-positive individuals, to untreated ASD children, reported significant improvements in overall autism severity in the treated group, with some children even showing what they termed complete recovery.
That's quite a range of findings, but overall it sounds like Leucovorin holds some real promise as a potential intervention for ASD, either on its own or as part of a broader treatment strategy.
Now, we always need to consider safety.
Of course.
What did the review find about how safe and well-tolerated leucovorin was in these studies? Encouragingly, the review indicates that leucovorin appears to be generally safe and well-tolerated in the studies they examined. The adverse effects that were reported were typically mild and included things like excitement or agitation, aggression, insomnia, increased tantrums, and headache.
And were these side effects clearly linked to the Leucovorin itself?
Interestingly, the placebo-controlled studies generally showed similar rates of these adverse effects in both the treatment and the placebo groups. This suggests that many of these might not have been directly caused by the leucovorin. Some studies even use leucovorin for extended periods, up to 2 years in some cases, without any significant safety concerns emerging.
Okay, that's really reassuring to hear. So to bring it all together, for you, our listener, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the research?
Well, the research strongly suggests a notable connection between disruptions in how folate gets to the brain, CFD, the presence of autoantibodies targeting the folate transporter, FRAAs, and autism spectrum disorder in a subset of individuals. Leucovorin, a readily available form of folate, shows significant promise as a potential treatment, particularly for improving communication and core ASD symptoms, especially in those who might have FRAAs or CFD. The fact that there's so much variation across studies makes me wonder if we're looking at a very specific subgroup of individuals with ASD who experience this, or if there are inconsistencies in how these conditions are being diagnosed and measured.
And the high prevalence of FRAAs in children with ASD as well as their parents and siblings
Yes,
seems like a really important area for future research.
it is.
It really makes you wonder if we're potentially uncovering a specific biological pathway that could be contributing to some of the challenges faced by individuals with ASD.
Absolutely. It raises questions about what might be underlying these autoantibodies and whether there are potential screening strategies that could be developed. The findings also underscore the complexity of ASD and suggest that for some individuals, metabolic factors like folate transport could be playing a really significant role. Ultimately, this research encourages a more personalized approach to understanding and supporting individuals with ASD.
So to summarize our key insights today, we've explored this intriguing link between brain folate, these autoantibodies, and ASD. The evidence suggests that CFD, potentially driven by FRAAs, is present in a notable portion of the ASD population. Furthermore, treatment with leucovorin shows real potential for improving core and associated symptoms, and it seems to have a relatively good safety profile.
That's a concise summary.
Thanks.
And it leads to a provocative thought for you, our listener. Considering these findings about FRAAs and families, could there be environmental factors interacting with individual predispositions that are key to understanding these folate-related issues in ASD? And if so, what kind of research could help us unravel these really complex interactions?
That's a really important question to ponder. This deep dive has really just scratched the surface of a dynamic area of research. If this topic has resonated with you, we really encourage you to explore the research we've discussed further and to talk about these findings with relevant healthcare professionals. Understanding the potential role of metabolic factors could really open up new avenues for support and more personalized interventions within the autism spectrum.
I agree. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this exploration has provided you with valuable insights and sparked further curiosity. We look forward to delving into more fascinating topics with you in the future.
See you next time.